Nationalism in India. As you have seen, modern nationalism in Europe came to be associated with the formation of nation-states. It also meant a change in people's understanding of who they were and what defined their identity and sense of belonging. New symbols and icons, new songs and ideas forged new links and redefined the boundaries of communities. In most countries, the making of this new national identity was a long process. How did this consciousness emerge in India? In India, and as in many other colonies, the growth of modern nationalism is intimately connected to the anti-colonial movement. People began discovering their unity in the process of their struggle with colonialism. The sense of being oppressed under colonialism provided a shared bond that tied many different groups together. But each class and group felt the effects of colonialism differently. Their experiences were varied, and their notions of freedom were not always the same. The Congress under Mahatma Gandhi tried to forge these groups together within one movement, but the unity did not emerge without conflict. In an earlier textbook, you have read about the growth of nationalism in India up to the first decade of the 20th century. In this chapter, we will pick up the story from the 1920s and study the non-cooperation and civil disobedience movements. We will explore how the Congress sought to develop the national movement, how different social groups participated in the movement, and how nationalism captured the imagination of people. 1. The First World War, Khilafat and Non-Cooperation. In the years after 1919, we see the national movement spreading to new areas, incorporating new social groups and developing new modes of struggle. How do we understand these developments? What implications did they have? First of all, the war created a new economic and political situation. It led to a huge increase in defense expenditure, which was financed by war loans and increase in taxes. Custom duties were raised and income tax introduced. Through the war years, prices increased, doubling between 1913 and 1918, leading to extreme hardships for the common people. Villages were called upon to supply soldiers, and the forced recruitment in rural areas caused widespread anger. Then, in 1918 to 1919 and 1920 to 1921, crops failed in many parts of India, resulting in acute shortages of food. This was accompanied by an influenza epidemic. According to the census of 1921, 12 to 13 million people perished as a result of famines and the epidemic. People hoped that their hardships would end after the war was over, but that did not happen. At this stage, a new leader appeared and suggested a new mode of struggle. 1.1 The idea of Satyagrah. Mahatma Gandhi returned to India in January 1915. As you know, he had come from South Africa, where he had successfully fought the racist regime with a novel method of mass agitation, which he called Satyagrah. The idea of Satyagrah emphasized the power of truth and the need to search for truth. It suggested that if the cause was true, if the struggle was against injustice, then physical force was not necessary to fight the oppressor. Without seeking vengeance or being aggressive, a Satyagrahi could win the battle through non-violence. This could be done by appealing to the conscience of the oppressor. People, including the oppressors, had to be persuaded to see the truth instead of being forced to accept truth through the use of violence. By this struggle, truth was bound to ultimately triumph. Mahatma Gandhi believed that this dharma of non-violence could unite all Indians. After arriving in India, Mahatma Gandhi successfully organized Satyagraha movements in various places. In 1917, he travelled to Champaran in Bihar to inspire the peasants to struggle against the oppressive plantation system. Then, in 1917, he organized Satyagraha to support the peasants of the Kheda district of Gujarat. Affected by crop failure and a plague epidemic, the peasants of Kheda could not pay the revenue and were demanding that revenue collection be relaxed. In 1918, Mahatma Gandhi went to Ahmedabad to organize a Satyagrah movement amongst cotton mill workers. 1.2 The Rowlatt Act. Emboldened with this success, Gandhiji in 1919 decided to launch a nationwide satyagraha against the proposed Rowlatt Act 1919. This act had been hurriedly passed through the Imperial Legislative Council despite the united opposition of the Indian members. It gave the government enormous powers to repress political activities and allowed detention of political prisoners without trial for 2 years. Mahatma Gandhi wanted non-violent civil disobedience against such unjust laws, which would start with a hartal on 6th April. Rallies were organized in various cities. Workers went on strike in railway workshops and shops closed down. Alarmed by the popular upsurge and scared that lines of communication such as railway and telegraph would be disrupted, the British administration decided to clamp down on nationalists. Local leaders were picked up from Amritsar and Mahatma Gandhi was barred from entering Delhi. On 10th April, the police in Amritsar fired upon a peaceful procession, provoking widespread attacks on banks, post offices, and railway stations. Martial law was imposed and General Dyer took command. On 13th April, the infamous Jalnawala Bagh incident took place. On that day, a large crowd gathered in the enclosed ground of Jalnawala Bagh. Some came to protest against the government's new repressive measures. Others had come to attend the annual Baisakhi fair. Being from outside the city, many villagers were unaware of the martial law that had been imposed. Dyer entered the area, blocked the exit points, and opened fire on the crowd, killing hundreds. His object, as he declared later, was to produce a moral effect to create in the minds of Satyagrahis a feeling of terror and awe. As the news of Jalnawala Bagh spread, crowds took to the streets in many North Indian towns. There were strikes, clashes with police, and attacks on government buildings. The government responded with brutal repression, seeking to humiliate and terrorize people. Satyagrahis were forced to rub their noses on the ground, crawl on the streets, and do salute to all sahibs. People were flogged and villages around Gujranwala in Punjab, now in Pakistan, were bombed. Seeing violence spread, Mahatma Gandhi called off the movement. While the Rowlatt Satyagraha had been a widespread movement, it was still limited mostly to cities and towns. Mahatma Gandhi now felt the need to launch a more broad-based movement in India. But he was certain that no such movement could be organized without bringing the Hindus and Muslims closer together. One way of doing this, he felt, was to take up the Khilafat issue. The First World War had ended up with the defeat of Ottoman Turkey, and there were rumors that a harsh peace treaty was going to be imposed on the Ottoman Emperor, the spiritual head of the Islamic world, the Khalifa. To defend the Khalifa's temporal powers, a Khilafat committee was formed in Bombay in March 1919. A young generation of Muslim leaders like brothers Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali began discussing with Mahatma Gandhi about the possibility of a united mass action on the issue. Gandhiji saw this as an opportunity to bring Muslims under the umbrella of a unified national movement. At the Calcutta session of the Congress in September 1920, he convinced other leaders of the need to start a non-cooperation movement in support of Khilafat as well as for Swaraj. 1.3 Why non-cooperation? In his famous book Hind Swaraj 1909, Mahatma Gandhi declared that British rule was established in India with the cooperation of Indians and had survived only because of the cooperation. If Indians refused to cooperate, British rule in India would collapse within a year and Swaraj would come. How could non-cooperation become a movement? Gandhiji proposed that the movement should unfold in stages. It should begin with the surrender of titles that government awarded and a boycott of civil services, army, police, courts and legislative councils, schools and foreign goods. Then in case the government used repression, a full civil disobedience campaign would be launched. Through the summer of 1920, Mahatma Gandhi and Shaukat Ali toured extensively, mobilizing popular support for the movement. Many with the Congress were however concerned about the proposals. They were reluctant to boycott the council elections scheduled for November 1920, and they feared that the movement might lead to popular violence. In the months between September and December, there was an intense tussle with the Congress. For a while, there seemed no meeting point between the supporters and the opponents of the movement. Finally, at the Congress session at Nagpur in December 1920, a compromise was worked out and the non-cooperation program was adopted. How did the movement unfold? Who participated in it? How did different social groups conceive of the idea of non-cooperation? 2. Differing strands within the movement. The non-cooperation Khilafat Moment began in January 1921. Various social groups participated in this movement, each with its own specific aspiration. All of them responded to the call of Swaraj, but the term meant different things to different people. 2.1 The Movement in Towns. The movement started with middle-class participation in the cities. Thousands of students left government-controlled schools and colleges. Headmasters and teachers resigned and lawyers gave up their legal practices. The council elections were boycotted in most provinces except Madras, where the Justice Party, the party of non-Brahmins, felt that entering council was one way of gaining some power, something that usually only Brahmins had access to. The effect of non-cooperation on the economic front were more dramatic. Foreign goods were boycotted, liquor shops picketed, and foreign cloth was burnt in huge bonfires. The import of foreign cloth halved between 1921 and 1922, its value dropping from Rs 102 crore to 57 crore. In many places, merchants and traders refused to trade in foreign goods or finance foreign trade. As the boycott movement spread and people began discarding imported clothes and wearing only Indian ones, production of Indian textile mills and handlooms went up. But this movement in the cities gradually slowed down for a variety of reasons. Khadi cloth was often more expensive than mass-produced mill cloth, and poor people could not afford to buy it. How then could they boycott mill cloth for too long? Similarly, the boycott of British institutions posed a problem. For the movement to be successful, alternative Indian institutions had to be set up so that they could be used in place of British ones. These were slow to come up, so students and teachers began trickling back to government schools and lawyers joined back work in government courts. 2.2 Rebellion in the countryside. From the cities, the non-cooperation movement spread to the countryside. It drew into its fold the struggles of peasants and tribals, which were developing in different parts of India in the years after war. In Awadh, peasants were led by Baba Ramchandra, a sannyasi who had earlier been to Fiji as an indentured labourer. The movement here was against talukdars and landlords, who demanded from peasants exorbitantly high rents and a variety of other cesses. Peasants had to do begar and work at landlords' farms without any payment. As tenants, they had no security of tenure, being regularly evicted so that they could acquire no right over the leased land. The peasant movement demanded reduction of revenue, abolition of begar, and social boycott of oppressive landlords. In many places, Nai Dhobi Bandhs were organized by panchayats to deprive landlords of the services of even barbers and washermen. In June 1920, Jawaharlal Nehru began going around the villages in Awadh, talking to the villagers and trying to understand their grievances. By October, the Audh Kisan Sabha was set up, headed by Jawaharlal Nehru, Baba Ramchandra and a few others. Within a month, over 300 branches had been set up in the villages around the region. So when the non-cooperation movement began, the following year, the effort of Congress was to integrate the Awadh peasant struggle into wider struggle. The peasant movement, however, developed in forms that the Congress leadership was unhappy with. As the movement spread in 1921, the houses of talukdars and merchants were attacked, bazaars were looted, and grain hoards were taken over. In many places, local leaders told peasants that Gandhiji had declared that no taxes were to be paid and land was to be redistributed among the poor. The name of Mahatma was being invoked to sanction all actions and aspirations. Tribal peasants interrupted the message of Mahatma Gandhi and the idea of Swaraj in yet another way. In the Kudem hills of Andhra Pradesh, for instance, a militant guerrilla movement spread in the early 1920s, not a form of struggle that the Congress could approve. Here, as in other forest regions, the colonial government had closed large forest areas, preventing people from entering the forest to graze their cattle or to collect fuel wood and fruits. This enraged the hill people. Not only were their livelihoods affected, but they felt that their traditional rights were being denied. When the government began forcing them to contribute begar for road building, the hill people revolted. The person who came to lead them was an interesting figure, Alluri Sitaraman Raju. Alluri Sitaram Raju claimed that he had a variety of special powers. He could make correct astrological predictions and heal people, and he could survive even bullet shots. Captivated by Raju, the rebels proclaimed that he was an incarnation of God. Raju talked of the greatness of Mahatma Gandhi and said he was inspired by the non-cooperation movement and persuaded people to wear khadi and give up drinking. But at the same time, he asserted that India could be liberated only by the use of force, not non-violence. The Gudem rebels attacked police station, attempted to kill British officials, and carried on guerrilla warfare for achieving Swaraj. Raju was captured and executed in 1924, and over the time became a folk hero. 2.3 Swaraj in plantations. Workers too had their own understanding of Mahatma Gandhi and the notion of Swaraj. For plantation workers in Assam, freedom meant the right to move freely in and out of the confined space in which they were enclosed, and it meant retaining a link with the village from which they had come. Under the Inland Immigration Act of 1859, the plantation workers were not permitted to leave the tea gardens without permission, and in fact, they were rarely given such permissions. When they heard of the non-cooperation movement, thousands of workers defied the authorities, left the plantations, and headed home. They believed that Gandhi Raj was coming and everyone would be given land in their own villages. They, however, never reached their destination. Stranded on the way by a railway and steamer strike, they were caught by the police and brutally beaten up. Thank you.